In the world of Formula One, there are few names more important than that of Jackie Stewart. In a career which spanned 9 seasons, 99 races and 27 race victories, Stewart claimed 3 world championships and, more importantly, survived to tell the tale. In a period when driver deaths were common, this was far from a given. Over time, Stewart became a voice for change, demanding the sport to be made safer. It's hard to believe today, but at the time Stewart's campaign was controversial, and he struggled for support from the very people he was seeking to protect. He was even labelled a coward for his unspoken demands for a safer sport. There was a good reason for Stewart's safety crusade. He was fortunate to survive more than one accident, but many of his friends were not. He lost several amongst the dozens of drivers killed during his time in Formula One, to the point where he once commented that he made an effort not to get close to his colleagues because the constant loss was too much to deal with. Stewart was born in 1939 into a family in the motor trade. His older brother Jimmy was an accomplished racer himself, going as far as to race in the 1953 British Grand Prix. The younger Stewart initially seemed to be destined for another calling, clay pigeon and skeet shooting, in which he won international championships and just missed out on a place in the British Olympic team for the 1960 Games in Rome. In 1961, at the behest of a customer of the family business, Stewart started entering motor races and winning them. After 3 successful seasons as an amateur part-time racer, he made the decision to turn professional. In early 1964, in his first ever test in a Formula 3 car, Stewart significantly outpaced Bruce McLaren, impressing Ken Tyrrell, who was then running the Cooper team's junior Formula entries. Tyrrell signed Stewart up on the spot, and Stewart repaid him by dominating not only his first race, but the whole championship, ending the season not only as champion, but having won all but 2 of the races. At the end of that year, Stewart had his first experience of a Grand Prix car, with a test drive for Lotus. He impressed Colin Chapman with his speed and control, and was given his race debut at the non-championship Rand Grand Prix, qualifying on pole for the first heat and winning the second. His Grand Prix debut came at the South African Grand Prix in a BRM as teammate to Graham Hill. He claimed a fine 6th place. In his next outing, he won the non-championship BRDC International Trophy at Silverstone, before beating Hill in a straight fight for victory at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, the first of his many Grand Prix victories. In a standout rookie season, as well as that win, he scored 4 other podium finishes and claimed a remarkable 3rd place in the championship. In 1966, BRM introduced its 16-cylinder 3-litre engine, but it was shockingly unreliable. Stewart claimed his 2nd Grand Prix victory at Monaco, achieved in a car with the less powerful 2-litre engine, but results were hard to come by for the rest of the season. He also went to Indianapolis and ran away with the 1966 500-mile race, only to be denied victory when a mechanical failure stopped his car with 8 laps remaining. He was a lap ahead when he was forced to drop out. If the BRM had been unreliable in 1966, then in 1967 it was even worse, with Stewart finishing just twice, making it to the podium each time. With BRM in a state of collapse, Stewart moved to Ken Tyrrell's Matra team for 1968, taking 3 victories and finishing 2nd in the World Championship to Graham Hill's Lotus. In 1969 he went one better, dominating the season with 6 wins, and he had clinched his first world title at Monza with a quarter of the season still to run. In 1970 Tyrrell switched from Matra to March, but was also in the process of building his own car. The result was a disappointing season, from which Stewart earned only a single victory and retired from half of the season's races with mechanical issues. In 1971, with the Tyrrell proving to be fast and reliable, Stewart dominated the championship once more, winning 6 of the 11 races and once more clinching the title with a quarter of the season still to run. In 1972, he lost out in the title race to Emerson Fittipaldi's Lotus, but in 1973 was again untouchable as he clinched his 3rd world title. Having decided to retire at the end of the season, what would have been his 100th Grand Prix, Stewart's exit from the sport came a day earlier than planned after his teammate, prodigy and closest friend, Francois Servet, was killed in a terrible accident during qualifying at Watkins Glen. Even after hanging up his gloves and helmet, Stewart continued to be a campaigner for safety in Formula One. As late as the early 90s, Stewart was approached by Ayrton Senna to help improve driver safety. And none of this would have happened but for an incredible escape from an accident at the Belgian Grand Prix in 1966, which would have probably resulted in his death 99 times in 100. Spa is an epic Grand Prix circuit today, but it pales in comparison to the full-length version which was raced up until 1970. Instead of turning right at Les Combes, the circuit turned left and ran down through the right-hand Bournonville and Malmedy corners and onto the Master Straight. Halfway along that straight was the Master Kink, a fearsome twitch of a corner taken almost flat out. In 1966 that meant over 180 miles an hour. The track then turned right again at Stavelot, running back up to Blanchimont, and then following the current course back to the beginning of the lap. Total length was nearly 9 miles, and the circuit stood comparison with the Nürburgring Nordschleife in more ways than one. Weather over such a long track can be a major problem. The area covered by the circuit can result in changing weather systems, most usually rain at one side of the track and dry weather at the other. In 1966, as the cars sped off on their first lap, a heavy rainstorm arrived from the south, soaking the track down the Master Straight and importantly at the Master Kink. As the field returned to the start line at the end of lap 1, 9 cars were missing. Bonnier, Spence, Siffert and Hulme had all crested the rise at the top of Bournonville and spun on the suddenly wet track. Bonnier came to rest halfway over a 6-metre drop, an image which was subsequently used in that year's Oscar-winning Grand Prix movie by John Frankenheimer. Meanwhile, Rindt had aquaplaned into a lurid sequence of spins down the Master Straight, somehow missed hitting anything as he spun, and just as miraculously not being collected by any of the other drivers. Stewart, Bondurant and Hill had lost control on the now drenched approach to the Master Kink, where a small river had formed. Hill crashed into hay bales and was able to exit his car unaided. The same was true for Bondurant, but Stewart had crashed into a telegraph pole, then smashed into a woodcutter's shed before ending up in a farmyard, crashing through a farmer's outbuilding and landing in the outside basement of a farmhouse. Stewart was trapped in his car, and the fully loaded fuel tanks were leaking petrol everywhere, including soaking Stewart's overalls. That the car didn't burst into flames as a result of fuel running onto hot engine parts was nothing short of a miracle, because there were no marshals, no fire extinguishers, and no assistance of any sort for a driver trapped in their car, burning or not. Bondurant and Hill were aware that Stewart had crashed with them, but couldn't see the BRM anywhere. Fortunately for Stewart, they had the foresight to go looking for his car. They found the Scotsman still in his BRM, conscious but trapped by the crushed chassis and his steering wheel. By now, Stewart's overalls were completely soaked in fuel, and the car was a literal firebomb just waiting to go off. Realising the situation with the leaking fuel tank, Hill and Bondurant sought out spectators and plundered tools from their cars in order to extricate Stewart from the wreck. Once they had him out, they stripped Stewart naked to prevent him from suffering chemical burns from the fuel which had soaked him. They sat him in a farmer's cart and then waited an inordinate amount of time for help to arrive. When an ambulance eventually arrived, Stewart was carted off to hospital, with the ambulance driver getting lost along the way, symptomatic of the lack of concern for drivers and their safety of the time. By the time he finally got to hospital, Stewart's injuries were determined to be no more than a broken collarbone, a truly remarkable escape given all that could have happened. It had, unsurprisingly, been a world-changing experience for Stewart, and he clearly understood just how close he came to losing his life that day. Not only were there no safety barriers to prevent his BRM from striking any number of roadside obstacles, of which there were many and not just at Spa, but there were no plans for rescuing a driver in the event of them having an accident. Even once they were rescued, there was no medical support to provide care in the immediate post-accident minutes, the period of time after a trauma which are well established as the most important in saving a patient's life. Stewart began by making changes to maximise his own safety. Going forward, he would travel to races with his own doctor, who was enough of a generalist to treat any injury Stewart might sustain. Should he have a survivable accident, he did not want to be at the mercy of local healthcare facilities, which in at least some of the countries where Grand Prix were being held, were medieval in comparison to the care provided by the NHS. He also began driving with a spanner in his car, that he might be able to remove his steering wheel should a similar set of circumstances arise. Being trapped in a car which could turn into a fireball at any moment certainly focused Stewart's mind on making sure that never happened to him again. As well as his own personal safety, Stewart began a campaign to improve safety for his colleagues, and for spectators too. This was just 5 years after the death of Wolfgang von Trips at Monza, when his Ferrari slammed into a spectator fence on the approach to Parabolica, killing 15 people, as well as the driver himself. At many circuits, especially those which were partially or fully run on closed roads, spectators still had no protection at all. For Stewart, the idea that a sport in which participants could suffer grievous injuries would have no medical facilities was no longer acceptable to him. The lack of safety barriers are nonsense. That drivers wouldn't be required to use the latest safety equipment, unthinkable. His campaign to right those wrongs brought him vilification from several areas. It seems that some spectators, the mainstream media, and even some of the drivers, saw the killing and maiming of drivers as an essential part of the charm of the sport. These swashbucklers with their playboy lifestyles were exciting because they were on the tightrope without a safety net. Adding the safety net took away some of the thrill. At the time of Stewart's accident at Spa, it was just over 20 years since the end of the Second World War. Anybody over the age of 40 had seen and done things which would today be inconceivable. Car crashes killed people every day. Why should Grand Prix driving be any different? Judging people for their actions at a different time is mostly unfair. No driver before Stewart had stood up and said that death was too high a price to pay for the sport. Stewart's popularity with the fans, together with his success, even in the face of what he saw as unacceptable risks, meant that the changes he sought were slowly adopted. Sadly, not before he lost close friends like Piers Courage, Jochen Rindt, Joe Siffert, and most of all, Francois Sever, who was killed in qualifying for what would have been Stewart's last race. Recency bias means that Stewart is often overlooked when discussion turns to the greatest drivers of all time, which is utter nonsense. Stewart's victories came at a time when the smallest mistake meant the end of a driver's race at best, possibly career-ending injuries, and often death. They were all the greater because they were achieved against a backdrop of terrible consequences. His car control was incredible. He was one of those rare drivers who looked like he wasn't even trying until you checked his lap times and found he was going faster than everyone else. His speed came with incredible consistency, and his mastery of difficult conditions was second to none. There are few drivers that you could pluck from their own era and drop into another and be confident that they would be just as successful. Jackie Stewart is one I have no doubt about. One of the greatest drivers of all time? Definitely. Possibly the greatest ever. Certainly the most important.